Hey guys, how we doing? I wanted to start just recording some, call them lectures for lack of a better term, just some kind of old school teaching and throwing them up on Canvas so you guys can just kind of get some different background information on some of the stuff that we're learning in class. Obviously, with North Nation by Design and the way we're doing things. Class looks a little bit different. Specifically, you're not necessarily sitting and getting me lecturing as much as maybe you would in a traditional class setting, which I know some of you have expressed interest on just knowing more and kind of hearing more of what the other students in other classes are doing. We're really looking at the same stuff. We're doing it differently. So over the course of the year, you'll really touch on all of the same things. It just really isn't necessarily in the same order or even in the same way. So I just wanted to record this and I'll try to be doing this regularly so that you have like this additional resource that you can use. Just to kind of give you some of that more nitty gritty, kind of really deep information if you're interested. Okay, so today we're going to talk about two things. Macromolecules as a whole is obviously where we've kind of started, but really the reason we've spent so much time on this is because everything we talk about throughout the course of this class all comes down to these four things, right? The carbohydrates, the lipids, the nucleic acids, and the proteins. Everything else you will learn throughout this year centers around how these guys are used in our bodies and how those make our bodies function. Okay. So obviously when we started looking at macromolecules, okay, these are the big, large molecules that make us up as individuals. All of those things are made up of these primary elements: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and oxygen, right? That's the chomps that we kind of briefly discussed. We talked about carbon being that most special one because of all the attachment points that carbons have, right? And those attachment points we call bonds. The bonds are really, really, really important because that's what holds things together. So since carbon has 4 bonds, whereas hydrogen only has 1 and oxygen only has 2, that allows carbon to create bigger molecules. So when you talk about humans and living organisms, one thing you might hear from time to time is that we're carbon based, right? And that means that we're made up by a lot of carbon, okay? And that's because of the complexity of that particular atom. Okay, so when we look at macromolecules, the first one that we've really spent a lot of the primary focus on, or what I've really kind of tried to drive you towards, was the primary focus on these guys, carbohydrates. Okay, and that's kind of this first stop, so to say, throughout the school year where we're really focusing in a little bit more detail. As we move, we'll focus more in on proteins, focus more in on nucleic acids, specifically when we start talking about DNA and how that works and genetics and all of that stuff. But carbohydrates is really kind of the first place that we have to start, because everything that we are and everything that we do really functions because of these carbohydrates. Okay, and so we know from class, obviously we've talked about carbohydrates being primarily all about energy. Okay, that's the most important thing when it comes to the job of carbohydrates. Okay, we use these simple carbs like glucose and fructose. Okay, glucose is like what we built in class with those models. We use those guys so that our cells can make this thing called ATP. Okay, and this ATP is the energy molecule that all of our cells use. Okay, and so remember when we talked about that model, okay, we looked at, you have this big glucose molecule, then you breathe in oxygen, and those two things break down to then make energy, which we saw as bonds. Okay, and one big thing to know and remember is that the bonds that hold molecules together, they store energy. Okay, because whenever I put two things together, I got to put energy into it, right? When I pull them apart, I got to take energy away, right? One of the best ways that I generally have described this in the past is if you have a pencil, this thing is stuck together, okay? And something had to make it like this so that it is in this shape, that it's in this particular orientation, okay? Something had to do work or put energy into making this pencil just like this, right? And if I wanted to break this pencil, it doesn't just break, right? I have to put energy into that. But when I break it, let's listen, what's released? A sound, which sound is energy, right? So when you break things, when you break the bonds of molecules, energy is released. So when you break down that glucose and break down that oxygen that you take in, that's creating, it's releasing energy, okay? Much like if I were to take a carbon and a hydrogen and I want to bond them together, I want to put them together, is this thing just going to stay together if I just leave these two pieces on the table? No, I have to put energy into piecing them back together and putting them together so that they hold, okay? And I probably can't make this work. But if I put enough energy into this and I fix it, it should be able to hold into one piece, okay? Because I'm putting energy into it. So when we talk about bonds, it's always synonymous with energy, because when you make bonds, you have to put energy into it. When you break bonds, energy is released, okay? Energy is created, okay? So that's really the big idea with carbohydrates, is that they make this energy, okay? These bigger carbohydrates, the complex carbs, those things are going to provide more structure, specifically in plants, okay? They like cellulose is an example of that. All cell walls in plants are made up of cellulose. It's a structure molecule. But when we talk about carbs, again, the primary focus is always centered around energy. And that's those simple carbs that we've talked quite a bit about, okay? So a couple words you might see from time to time is this monosaccharide, polysaccharide. That's just the names of the monomers of carbohydrates. One saccharide, one carbohydrate. Poly is many, many carbohydrates, many saccharides. It's the same thing, okay? It's whether you have one glucose molecule or whether you bond 3 glucose molecules together. That's what you're looking at there. Remember that monomer polymer term is what we kind of mentioned with these Lego pieces, right? One Lego piece is a monomer. You put many of them together, that makes a polymer, okay? Very good. So really, when it comes to what we need to know about carbohydrates, that's point blank is that it provides energy, okay? But the next step from there is really looking at this process of cellular respiration. And in traditional biology, we would probably spend weeks talking about this, but in reality, all we really need to know is what we talked about on Thursday and Friday of last week, is that you take glucose, you take oxygen, you put them together in the mitochondria, and the mitochondria breaks them down to produce CO2 and energy, okay? And so I want to just walk you through that process really quick, just as a good to know, not necessarily a need to know, and kind of talk about this term or this idea, this process of cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is what our bodies do, what our cells do to make that energy. Okay, so obviously energy is really important. Okay, the primary place that we get this energy from is those glucoses and other sugars. Notice it says 6 carbon sugars because those sugars are made up of carbon, because that allows those sugars to be really big and complex. Glucose, if you remember the model we built, there were 6 sugars involved in that molecule. There were 6 carbons involved in building that sugar molecule. Okay, so other ways that we get energy are fatty acids. Okay, if you remember correctly, we've talked about when you don't have carbohydrates, your body uses fats to make energy, right? That's like the keto diet. That's why the keto diet works so well in losing weight, is because you don't take in these sugars. Instead, you break down these fatty acids. Okay, and then worst case scenario, if your body can't get the sugars or the fats to break down, it's going to start taking away protein. Okay, and that's why if you look at people in third world countries, who don't eat, who are starving, who don't have access to food, the last thing you'll start to see go on them is their muscles, right? And you see them really shriveled and really tiny and no muscles on their body, because when you don't have carbs to burn, when you don't have fats to burn, your body then starts burning amino acids, which is what makes up your proteins. And we know that muscles are made up of proteins, okay? And so that is what would go next, okay? So cellular respiration, in a nutshell, I've mentioned it 100 times already, I think, is all about taking the sugar molecule, taking the air you breathe, and creating this thing called ATP, this energy molecule. Okay, and I want you to just look at this picture here real quick. This is an ATP molecule. Okay, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So triphosphate means 3 phosphates. If you look at this molecule, right here, you have a P, that's a phosphate. And since this is triphosphate, you see 1, 2, 3. Okay? Now, your cells use this molecule for the energy that it needs to do its functions. And so if you look, this bond right here that holds this phosphate to this phosphate, that's where all your energy is stored, in that bond. So when you make this molecule, what your body does, what your cells do, is it breaks off this phosphate, which releases energy, right? Remember, bonds break, they release energy, okay? And then you end up with a new molecule that is only 2 phosphates, which is adenosine diphosphate, ADP, okay? And so then what your body does is it then takes that ADP molecule, it adds a phosphate to it through this process of cellular respiration, and that's what creates ATP. That's what creates that energy. Okay? So moving along, really, let's see. So what I want you to think about is animals, we eat our food. Okay? So we're what are called heterotrophs. Okay? We eat our own food, so therefore the only thing that we have to do is eat, so then our body can make energy. Okay, some organisms, though, like plants, they're autotrophs. They make their own food. They don't have to eat, so they have an extra step, right? Think about plants. How do they get the food that they need? Photosynthesis, right? So they have photosynthesis to make sugar, which then they use to do cellular respiration. We don't have to do photosynthesis like plants do because we eat the sugars that we need. We don't have to make them. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So let's jump down. I'm going to skip some of this. So I just want us to look at this equation. So with cellular respiration, you have this big long equation with a bunch of letters, bunch of numbers. Okay. Firstly, you have C6H12O6. That's glucose. That's sugar. Okay. So in cellular respiration, we eat the sugar, and then we breathe in 6O2. That's oxygen. Okay, so you take those things in. Again, we talked about your body breaking them down, putting them into your bloodstream, traveling throughout your bloodstream to go to your cells. Okay, and then once they get to your cells, your mitochondria uses those things to then create 6 CO2s, 6 H2Os, and that ATP. Okay, if you look and rearrange like we did with the models, if you look at all of these, the C6s, H12s, O6, 6 O2s, if you added all of those atoms up, you have the same exact number of atoms over here. They get broken down and just rearranged, okay? But you end up with something different, right? You start with sugar and oxygen, you end with CO2. That's what you breathe out, okay? And water and energy, okay? So if we look at cellular respiration as a whole, I don't know if I want to necessarily go into each of those steps, but this is a good kind of chart to know, okay, as far as how this works. Cellular respiration, here's the equation, okay? Here's the equation, here's the reactants. These are what go into the reaction, okay? You have glucose and oxygen. What comes out, the products are water, CO2, and ATP. ATP, your cells use to function. CO2 you breathe out as a byproduct, and the water your cells use as well. Okay, this is all done so that you can break down glucose to produce energy. Okay, it happens in the mitochondria, and both plants and animals do this to get energy.